My father taught me how to shake a man's hand like I meant it, how to check the oil in a car before a long drive, and how to sit with someone in silence when words weren't going to help. He spent 38 years as a high school shop teacher in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and every single one of his former students who saw him at the grocery store or the hardware store still called him Mr. Kowalski. He never once told me that. I only know because they told me at his retirement party, one after another, like they'd been saving it up. So when I tell you that the woman my son brought into our family tried to take him from us, tried to use him, drain him, and discard him like he was furniture she was done with, you need to understand that wasn't a family dispute, that was an erasure. Someone tried to erase a man who had spent his entire life quietly building things for other people, and she thought none of us would notice until it was too late. My name is Richard Kowalski. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a claims supervisor for an insurance company in Memphis, Tennessee, and if I'm being completely honest with you, and I decided before I started telling this story that I would be my failure, was that I always assumed my family was solid. I treated it like a foundation I'd already poured and tested. I stopped checking for cracks. Welcome, folks. If you're joining me for the first time tonight, I'm glad you found your way here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit like if stories about protecting the people who matter most speak to something in you. Because what happened on a Tuesday morning in February, and what I discovered 3 days later in a county records office, is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My father's name is Walter. He's 74 years old. He's 5'9", down from the 5'11" he claims he used to be, and he will argue that point if you give him the chance. He has hands that look like they were carved out of something hard, knuckles swollen from 40 years of working with tools, and he has never in his life asked anyone to feel sorry for him. When my mother passed away 11 years ago, he cleaned out her closet himself, folded everything neatly, and drove it to the women's shelter on Maple without telling a soul. I found a receipt in his kitchen drawer 3 months later. He still cooked Sunday pot roast every week, even after she was gone, even after it was just him, because he said the smell of it made the house feel right. He owns a small house in Covington, Louisiana, on a quiet street with a pecan tree in the front yard that he planted himself in 1987. He mows his own lawn. He keeps his truck washed. Every Thursday morning he drives 12 minutes to the senior center and teaches a woodworking class for free. Has done it for 6 years. And when I asked him once why he kept doing it without any pay, he looked at me like I'd asked something slightly stupid. He said, "Because they show up, Richard." That was the whole answer. My son Daniel is 38. He married a woman named Sasha 4 years ago. And I want to be fair to myself here because I think fairness matters when you're telling a story like this one. I did not dislike Sasha in the beginning. She was quick-witted and well-dressed, and she made Daniel laugh in a way I hadn't seen in a while. And for the first year I told myself that was enough. What I noticed, and chose to explain away, was that she managed conversations. She managed them the way someone manages a meeting. She decided who was relevant and who was background. My father, from very early on, was background. The Sunday dinners tapered off starting about 18 months into their marriage. It was never a declaration, never a confrontation. It was always something. A prior commitment, a headache, a tone in my son's voice when I suggested we include pop that told me not to push, and I didn't push. I told myself Daniel was navigating something, and that the best thing I could do was give him room. I told myself my father was fine. He was self-sufficient. He didn't need to be included in every gathering. I told myself a version of events that was easier to live inside of, and I let it run for almost 2 years. And that is the part of this story that belongs to me. What I didn't know, what my father never told me because he has never in his life chosen himself over someone else's comfort, was that Sasha had been visiting him alone. Not with Daniel. Alone. She'd come by the house in Covington 2 or 3 times over the span of about 8 months, always with something framed as kindness, helping him organize paperwork, talking about how complicated estates can get for older folks who live alone, bringing him a casserole, and then staying 2 hours to discuss what a burden property can be when you're getting on in years. My father, who is sharp as a tack and always has been, told me later that something felt off about those visits, but that he hadn't wanted to cause trouble between Daniel and me. So he was quiet. He smiled and said thank you for the casserole, and walked her to the door each time, and then sat in his kitchen afterward, feeling something he couldn't yet name. The visit in February was different. I got the call on a Tuesday morning at 8:14. I know the exact time because I'd just sat down at my kitchen table with the first cup of coffee I'd poured, and the mug was still burning my hand when I picked up the phone. It was my father's neighbor, a woman named Carol Bro. She's 71, been on that street for 22 years, and she and my father have a standing arrangement where if either of them doesn't see the other's porch light go off by 9 in the morning, someone goes to check. She's diabetic, and he's alone. And they made that agreement without ceremony about 4 years back, and neither of them has ever mentioned it as anything remarkable. Carol said, "Richard, I don't want to alarm you, but your dad's on his back porch and I think something happened. He won't call you himself. You know how he is. But his hand looks wrong and he told me he didn't want to make a fuss." I was in my car before she finished the sentence. When I got to Covington, my father was sitting in the lawn chair on his back porch with a bag of frozen corn wrapped around his left wrist. His face was doing what his face does when he's in pain and trying not to show it, jaw set, eyes a little too steady, the look he's had since I was a child and I've learned to read like weather. Carol was standing next to him with her hand on his shoulder. There was a broken clay pot by the back steps, soil scattered across the concrete, a geranium he'd been keeping alive since October lying on its side. I crouched down next to him. "Pop, tell me what happened." He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at the broken pot. "Sasha came by this morning," he said. He stopped. "She had some papers she wanted me to sign. Said it was to help simplify things. Protect the family," she said. "I told her I wasn't going to sign anything without reading it first and talking to you." He paused. "She didn't take that well." "What happened to your wrist, Dad?" He didn't answer right away. Carol answered for him because she'd seen it through the fence. Sasha had grabbed the papers back when my father refused to sign. She'd shoved past him to get to the back door she'd come through the house, had apparently let herself in, something my father had not yet explained to me, and I didn't press right then, and my father had caught himself on the porch railing when she pushed past him and gone down on his left hand. The clay pot had gone off the railing with him. She'd left without looking back. His wrist was fractured. A small fracture, the ER doctor said. The kind that heals clean in older adults if they're careful. But a fracture. He was 74 years old with a broken wrist and frozen corn because he hadn't wanted to make a fuss. I want to pause here because I want you to feel that for a second. My father, who taught shop for 38 years and built the bed frame I still sleep on as a wedding gift, and drove 4 hours in a rainstorm to help me move into my first apartment, was sitting on his back porch with a bag of frozen corn because he hadn't wanted to bother me. That is the kind of man he is. And that is exactly what Sasha had been counting on. I called Daniel from the ER waiting room. He picked up on the third ring, and his voice was the voice of someone who hadn't been told yet, someone still in the part of the morning that was ordinary. I told him what happened plainly, because I didn't trust myself to do it any other way. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "Dad, I'm sure it was an accident." Sasha wouldn't. "Your grandfather has a broken wrist, Daniel." Another silence. Then, quieter. "I'll call her." "What I need you to do," I said, "is come to this hospital." He came. He sat in that waiting room with me, and he didn't defend her again, not out loud, and I didn't ask him to perform his feelings for me. We sat there the way my father taught me to sit with someone when words aren't going to help. But I watched something working in my son's face, some arithmetic he didn't want to finish. And I recognized it because I'd been doing the same arithmetic for 2 years and calling it keeping the peace. The papers. That was the thing I kept coming back to while we sat there waiting. What papers had she brought that were so important? She'd driven 40 minutes to Covington on a Tuesday morning to get a 74-year-old man to sign before he'd had a chance to read them or call me. My father had managed to hold on to one page. It had fluttered off the porch when the pot broke and landed under the chair, and he'd put it in his shirt pocket before Carol arrived, almost out of instinct. He gave it to me in the ER and watched my face while I read it. It was a limited power of attorney document. Sasha's name was on it. My father's name was on it. The scope of it, and I read it 3 times because I needed to be sure, granted her the authority to act on his behalf in real property transactions. His house. The house with the pecan tree he planted in 1987. She had the right, if he'd signed it, to list it, sell it, and collect on his behalf. I didn't raise my voice. I stood in that hallway outside my father's room and I read that page, and I was very still and very quiet, and my son watched me from the plastic chair across the hall. And I think he understood something in that moment that he had not let himself understand before. 3 days later, I went to the St. Tammany Parish Clerk of Court's office and asked for a records search. What I found made the POA document look like a rough draft. 8 months earlier, a document had been filed prepared by a notary whose name I didn't recognize, attempting to add Sasha as a co-owner of my father's property. The document had my father's name on it. It had what was presented as his signature. My father, when I showed it to him, looked at it for a long time. He said, very quietly, "Richard, I never signed that." And then he said, "I never signed anything for that woman." His handwriting is something I've known my entire life. The signature on that document was not his. Someone had forged my father's name on a real property filing in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, and then filed it with the county clerk's office 8 months before she showed up at his door with a power of attorney document she needed him to sign before I found out about any of it. I want you to understand the architecture of what I'm describing, because I needed several days to understand it myself. The co-ownership filing was the first move. It would have established a legal claim to his property. The POA was the second move. With both in place, she could have listed the house, sold it, and moved the money before my father or I had standing to easily unwind it. His house, which he owns outright, had been appraised at $412,000. She wasn't improvising. She had been building this, layer by layer, for the better part of a year. I went to a real estate attorney the following Monday. I went to the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office the day after that. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Detective Fontaine, patient and precise, listened to everything I said and then looked at the documents I'd brought and then looked at me and said, "Mr. Kowalski, what you're describing, if the signature is forged, is felony fraud and elder financial exploitation under Louisiana state law. That is not a civil matter. That is a criminal matter." She said they would need a handwriting analysis. She said it would take some time. She said, "Let me be clear with you in this state. Elder financial exploitation carries mandatory prison time." I drove home from that meeting and I sat in my driveway for a while. I thought about the Sunday pot roast he still makes every week because the smell makes the house feel right. I thought about the frozen corn. I thought about the clay pot and the geranium on its side on the back steps and my father saying he hadn't wanted to make a fuss. I thought about 2 years of Sunday dinners that tapered off so gradually I'd told myself it was just life, just the way things settle, just Daniel and Sasha finding their own rhythm. I thought about all the arithmetic I hadn't let myself finish. Daniel sat across from me at my kitchen table that Thursday evening, and I told him everything. Not as an accusation, not as a verdict. I laid the documents on the table between us, the county filing, the POA page, the attorney's notes, and I let him read. He read slowly. He read everything twice. When he was done, he sat with his hands flat on the table, and he looked at a point somewhere past my shoulder, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know." I told him I believed him. I told him that believing him didn't change what the documents said. I told him that his grandfather had a broken wrist and a forged signature on a county filing, and that I needed to know which direction my son was going to face when this was over. He didn't answer me right then. He drove home, and I let him go, because he needed to do his own arithmetic in his own time, and I had learned, late, that you cannot finish that calculation for another person. He called me the following morning. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer of his own. He said he wasn't going to protect her. He said, "Tell me what you need from me, Dad." That phone call cost him something real, and I have not forgotten it. The handwriting analysis came back 5 weeks later. The signature on the county filing was definitively not my father's. The notary who had processed the document was subsequently investigated and lost their commission. Sasha was arrested on a Thursday afternoon in April, and charged with forgery, filing a false public record, and felony elder financial exploitation. Louisiana takes that last charge seriously. It is not a misdemeanor. It is not probation. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence. She was convicted 7 months later. She received 4 years in the Louisiana State Correctional System with eligibility for parole after 2. Her attorney argued she had been acting to protect the family's financial interests and that no actual money had changed hands because the scheme had been interrupted before completion. The judge was not moved. He said, "And I want to be precise about this because it mattered to me. The absence of a completed theft does not mitigate the deliberate, methodical targeting of a vulnerable elderly man by someone entrusted with access to his home and his trust. This court does not grade elder exploitation on a curve." 6 words I have thought about every day since. I will tell you what happened to my father's house. It is still his. The pecan tree is still in the front yard. He mowed his lawn last Saturday and Carol Bro waved to him from her porch and he waved back. The geranium, the one that came off the railing when he fell, he repotted it in March and it came back. He told me that with a kind of satisfaction that was very quiet and very Walter Kowalski. His wrist healed in 8 weeks. He was back at the senior center woodworking class in 9, which was a week earlier than the doctor recommended. And when I mentioned that, he told me the class was on Thursdays, and he wasn't going to make those folks come in on a Friday just because he'd been slow healing. I did not argue. My son Daniel filed for divorce 4 months after the arrest. I did not tell him to. I did not ask him to. I watched him arrive at that decision the way I watched him learn to drive from the passenger seat, hands in my lap, trying not to reach for the wheel. He is 38 years old and he is figuring out what kind of man he wants to be on the other side of this, and I think he is going to be okay. I told him that. He didn't say much back, but he drove me to the courthouse when I had to file some final paperwork in November, and he sat in the parking lot and waited for me. And when I came out, he had gotten me a coffee from the drive-thru next door, black, the way I take it. That was enough. I rewrote my own will in the months after this. I'd been meaning to update it for years and kept not doing it, which is something I now understand differently. I sat with my attorney, and I updated the beneficiaries, and I established a small trust with my father, named as a protected beneficiary with independent trustee oversight. The independent trustee is Carol Bro, who cried when I asked her and then said, "I'm not doing this for a reward, Richard." I told her that was exactly why I was asking her. My father doesn't entirely understand the legal architecture of what I set up. He understands that the house is his, that nobody can touch it, and that Carol is officially involved in his affairs in a way that means someone is always paying attention. He seemed satisfied with that. He made pot roast the Sunday after I told him, and he let me eat 2 bowls of it, and at some point near the end of the afternoon he said, completely unprompted, "You did good, son." He went back to watching the game. I sat there for a minute with that. I don't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that with you folks, because I think triumph is the wrong register for a story like this one. What I feel is something I would call clear-eyed. I can see the last 3 years differently now, not with the comfort of a story I was telling myself, but with the shape of what was actually happening while I looked away. My father was being managed. He was being positioned and isolated, and I called it family life, finding its own rhythm. I called it Daniel and Sasha doing their own thing. I called it a lot of things that were easier than what it actually was, and the cost of that comfort was a broken wrist and a frozen corn bag and a man sitting on his back porch not wanting to make a fuss. I'm not circling back to that version of comfortable. I closed that door. What I know now is that the people who are quiet about their pain are not fine just because they're quiet. The people who say they don't want to make a fuss are often the ones most in need of someone who shows up and makes the fuss for them. My father spent 38 years showing up for other people's kids in a shop class, teaching them how to build things that would outlast them. He planted a pecan tree in 1987 that still gives shade to a front yard he earned. He cooked a pot roast every single Sunday for 11 years, in a house that sometimes must have felt very large and very quiet, and he never once asked me to feel sorry for him about any of it. The least I could do was show up on a Tuesday morning when Carol Bro called, and keep showing up after that, and not stop until every document was right, and every door was closed, and the house with the pecan tree was safe. If this story landed somewhere real for you tonight, I want to ask you something specific. Think about the older person in your life who never calls to complain, the one who says everything is fine and means it as a gift to you, rather than a report on how things actually are. Check on them, not with a text. Go by, sit down, look at their hands, ask a real question, and then wait for the real answer. Don't make them have to call a neighbor first. That's all for tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one. And I'll see you in the next story.